A few notes on how a computer works. From the book Guida al Personal Computer by Ciro Discepolo, Blue Diamond Publisher, 1994, 128 pages, created in collaboration with the engineer Enzo Di Sarno, my dear friend and guiding star for many of my fellow citizens, and not only in those exciting years of the birth of the personal computer. But let's return to the present topic and note that the opposite of analogical thought, which I have just tried to illustrate with the pictorial metaphor, there is binary logic thought, where either a white or a black exists, without any shade of gray in between. A light bulb turned on is a white, we can establish, and a light bulb turned off represents a black. In short, a 1 opposed to a 0. This is what underlies the functioning of the computer. What is the computer? It is a fast idiot. This extraordinary instrument of our present, and especially of our future, a true lever of human potential, is nothing more, in fact, than a machine that can perform very quickly only additions and subtractions. Don't let yourselves be dazzled by appearances beyond science fiction technologies. This machine can only do additions and subtractions, nothing more. The electronic processor is only able to perform additions or subtractions, yes and no. To understand this, we must first consider that it is a machine, and therefore man can only have a primitive type of dialogue with it, and certainly cannot expect it to reason like a human being. In order to communicate with it, man must use clear messages, precisely those of the so-called binary logic. Don't be afraid. These are elementary concepts that can be learned in 2 words. Do you want an example? Think of Pavlov's conditioned reflexes. This scientist taught dogs that when he rang the bell, he would bring them food, with the result that after many repetitions, it was enough to ring the bell to obtain abundant salivation in the animals thus trained. So, in binary logic, this means that the bell ringing is a yes. A light bulb in the same way will be a yes if it is on, and a no if it is off. Let's proceed with another example that is a classic but no less interesting. Let's say that Mr. Bow has his office right in front of his house, and in the evening he wants to know if it is time to go home. Then he will agree with his wife not to waste useless phone calls, and will tell her, "If you're back home, pull down half the shutter on the first window on the left, otherwise keep them all up." We are faced with another example of binary language. A lowered shutter means yes, and a raised shutter means no. Now, let's say our friend gets a taste for it and decides to exchange more complex messages with his wife, also using the 4 windows on their lower floor. He will tell his wife that if she needs bread, she will also have to lower the left shutter of the bottom window, otherwise the first message will remain unchanged. You realize then that by using the lowered yes or raised no position of all 8 windows, our friends will be able to exchange rather complex messages by inventing their own alphabet. This could mean, for example, that after prior agreement, if the lowered shutters are the 2nd, 5th, and 8th, then the wife will want to send the letter A to her husband. If instead the closed shutters are the 1st, 4th, and 5th, then the wife will want to send a B to him, and so on, for the entire alphabet. Now the computer can do nothing other than count how many lowered shutters there are compared to how many raised ones. Nothing else. And let's see how the computer knows that the shutters are down. Let's start with the thermionic valve, that electronic component that was used in radios and televisions over 30 years ago. These lines are taken from my book Guida al Personal Computer, Blue Diamond publisher, Milan, 1994. The valve is schematized in the figure, the rectangle colored in blue. The valve consisted of a glass casing in which a vacuum was created and inside which two thin metal surfaces were placed, one below and one above. The lower one, called the cathode, was heated and allowed the electrons to detach. These were attracted by the anode, the other metal piece placed higher up, to which a positive electrical voltage was applied. In this way, the flow of electrons was not controlled, and the valve in question was called a diode. But if a thin metal grid with adjustable electrical voltage was placed between the two metal pieces in a vacuum, it was possible to control, to the point of nullifying, the flow of electrons from the cathode to the anode. In short, by regulating a small electrical voltage on the grid, it was possible to determine the flow of electrons, a valve on, i.e. a yes, or the absence of electrons, valve off, i.e. a no. This last type of valve just described was called a triode. The transistor works in practically the same way, but using semiconductor materials, i.e. thin layers of silicon appropriately doped, as they say in chemical jargon. We won't explain here how this happens, but it's enough to say that even with the transistor, we can obtain two very distinct and separate conditions: a transistor on, in which the electric current passes, and a transistor off, in which no electric current passes. In short, a condition of 1 or 0. But the transistor was still a component that was too large, on the order of a few square millimeters, and that dissipated too much power. So, in the early 1960s, scientists built the first integrated circuits, also called chips. They were obtained with a method similar to a brush stroke. That's right, a little bit of silicon, a few thousandths of a millimeter, was passed over a layer of non-conductive material, then another little bit of silicon with a different electrical conduction, and then another little bit of silicon. This resulted in a first transistor. Then a second transistor was brushed over the same layer, and so on for thousands and thousands, all in a few square millimeters of surface. We're well on our way. Keep following me. So, if we put current meters inside these integrated circuits, we get a monitoring of the flow of yeses and nos. In computer language, a yes or a no is called a bit. Basically, an open or closed shutter represents a bit. 8 bits make up a byte. That is a piece of information as complete as a letter R, or a P, or the plus sign, a question mark. The 8 windows, you will have understood, are the basic system with which a computer operates. Current computers work with much more than 8 windows, even 64 at a time, and of course allow a much more complex exchange of information. But in the end, as you will have understood, it is always a matter of adding open windows and closed windows, yeses and nos. Now suppose we set up a whole series of integrated circuits to allow the transfer of many groups of bytes at a time. To read all the yeses and nos in play, we must ensure that after each reading everything is reset to 0 and a new count is made. So imagine a policeman with a whistle who, every time he blows his whistle, activates the electricity meters that will tell you how many yeses and nos are in play at that moment. Immediately after each blow, everything is reset to 0, and we start again. The policeman with the whistle is what is called a clock in electronics, and establishes the time interval between one count and another. If we mount many integrated circuits in the same casing, a few square millimeters, we obtain a microprocessor that is the real heart of a personal computer. I rely on the fact that my professors who taught me electronics about 30 years ago, I wrote these lines in 1994, author's note, are not reading me, otherwise they might even lynch me. But if I allow myself some liberties of extreme disclosure, bordering on little accuracy, it is only in support of the attempt to make these concepts understand even to people who are completely unfamiliar with these issues. Let's get back to our discussion. The first microprocessors had a clock of about 1 megahertz, which means that they read the yeses and nos about 1,000,000 times every second. This justifies my initial adjective of fast, given to the computer that is also stupid, because it can only add the yeses and nos. Today we have microprocessors with clocks of 100 megahertz that can update 100 million times every second. In 2019, we are talking about many billions of times per second. Author's note. Continue in the book cited. Now, to conclude these few lines of a possible first literacy on the subject of computers, intended for those who absolutely do not know what a computer is, allow me also a dive into my distant past that always gives me strong emotions. As a boy, around the age of 15, I enjoyed building tube and transistor and crystal radios. I made a small discovery, and I don't know if I was the first to notice it, but when I wrote about it in an article that I sent to an electronics magazine of the time, year 1964 or 1965 perhaps, they welcomed it with great interest and published it. The thing can be explained quite simply. I had noticed that if I used any transistor of that era and connected with tweezers the collector and the emitter to the two plugs of a pair of headphones, and then with 2 fingers of my hand I squeezed the third pole of the transistor, the base, I listened to the broadcasts of Radio RAI-2, the most powerful radio signal at the time, in the headphones. Nothing special, but something that gave me a lot of emotions, and that a physicist explained to me in the sense that I had created involuntarily a small crystal radio. The crystal was the transistor itself, and I, with my fingers holding one of the 3 small metal wires of the transistor, acted as an antenna, and no electrical power was needed to make the whole thing work.